Welcome to the Nerd Reich Podcast. I'm Gil Duran. Let's get straight to it. The war on truth isn't some abstract concept debated in academic circles. It's not a hypothetical future we need to worry about later. It's happening right now. And what's truly chilling is that this assault on reality is being actively bankrolled, funded, orchestrated by some of the wealthiest people on the planet. This includes people like Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, and David Sachs, all of whom have aligned with Trump's MAGA movement in 2025. And today I'm talking to someone who's done the painstaking work of exposing exactly how this is happening, not just with ownership of obvious media outlets, but by purchasing some formerly progressive voices to push their narratives. Our guest is journalist Eoin Higgins. He's written an explosive new book, Owned: How Tech Billionaires on the Right Bought the Loudest Voices on the Left. Eoin has meticulously tracked a disturbing trend: how right-wing tech billionaires are strategically infiltrating media organizations and subtly, yet powerfully, influencing even writers who consider themselves to be on the left. He's uncovered the financial ties, the subtle pressures, and the ideological shifts that are reshaping our news landscape. This isn't about partisan bickering. It's about something far more fundamental. It's about the erosion of independent thought, the silencing of dissenting voices, and the manipulation of public opinion on a scale we haven't seen before. It's devious, it's calculated, and frankly, it's working. Let's get into it with Eoin Higgins. I was very glad to see your book. I first read it when The Galleys first came out, so this is my second time going through Owned. Thanks for writing it. It's one of the few books that exist in which I'm mentioned and my work is mentioned. So Eoin, your book examines how a handful of interconnected tech billionaires are trying to buy the media so that they can control the narrative, control politics, and control the world. This is obviously an urgent topic, given that Elon Musk, owner of Twitter, now controls the federal government, and he's not alone. All the guys that your book is about, Peter Thiel, Marc Andreessen, David Sachs, they're all characters in this federal drama we see playing out in Washington. So it's a very timely book. But let's rewind and start from the beginning. Why did you decide to write this book, and why was this an important story to tell right now?
The genesis for the book probably comes from a number of articles that I have written, I think, since at least since 2021, maybe a little earlier, talking about both the kind of tech billionaire control / desired control of media, the kind of journey to the right, particularly of Glenn Greenwald, but also of Matt Taibbi, these two kind of formerly left-aligned journalists who have ended up kind of being just Republican pundits at this point, for all intents and purposes. Bold Type Books reached out to me because they wanted someone to write a book about Greenwald and Taibbi specifically, and my name had come up a number of times as someone who was kind of like a vociferous critic of them, and I was like very happy for the opportunity because I think, and as anybody who reads the book can tell, like I have a lot of thoughts about these guys, and I think I have a relatively like nuanced take, at least on Greenwald. I said, yeah, I would love to do that, but the only thing is I also want to write about this tech billionaire media takeover because I think that's a really important part of the story. And so they were totally on board with that. And I started to write it. And as I started to write it, kind of continued to evolve as I was writing it because of what was going on politically in the country. So it was not only kind of about, it kind of became not only about like media, but also about like tech and the history of tech and politics and kind of American politics.
And you mentioned their names, but your book largely tells the story through the trajectory of two journalists, Glenn Greenwald and Matt Taibbi, who went from being journalists who challenged power and to some degree seemed to align with the left to becoming servants of right-wing power and wealth. Greenwald, for instance, who once heavily criticized Fox, is now a regular guest there and hosts a show on Rumble, a right-wing YouTube clone, where the partial investor is surveillance billionaire Peter Thiel. Let's start with Greenwald. You've seen his journey, and it's a major framing for the book. How did his transformation take place, and why is it important to understand his story?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that like I knew him personally, like online. I wouldn't say that like we were friends, but we were certainly friendly. We had a lot of similar interests, and I think that those mostly come from he kind of entered the blogosphere in 2005, maybe a little earlier with his blog Unclaimed Territory. He then kind of moved to Salon from there and then to The Guardian, at which point he broke the Snowden story and then started The Intercept. The thing that always appealed to me about Glenn, because I think I discovered him when he was at Salon, although maybe a little bit earlier, was that he not only was a vociferous critic of the Bush administration's so-called war on terror, both neocon and Christian right conservatism that seems almost kind of quaint now, that existed at the time, that I was also, I hated it as well. So I enjoyed reading his stuff about this. When the Democrats came to power in 2008, but even before that, he was also very critical of them. And I also really appreciated that as well, because I was not crazy about the way the Democrats were acting. I seldom am crazy about the way the Democrats are acting. He was a kind of good conduit to that. He was expressing a specific type of anger. I think I refer to myself in the book as a civil libertarian leftist. I think that's where my politics come from. And I think that Glenn, at least at the time, was at least aligned with those politics. Yeah, he was a huge critic of Fox. In fact, during his time at Salon, he would speak about MSNBC as, having some problems, but because they had him on TV, he would say that they were much better than Fox, which didn't have him on TV, because Fox had no kind of ideological gray areas. It was just like black and white, you're either with us or against us. The terminology and the language that he used back then to describe MSNBC as opposed to Fox almost exactly mirrors the way that he would then go on to talk about Fox and MSNBC. Through his career at The Intercept, after the Snowden leaks, that's the NSA scandal, a huge story, he reached out to Glenn multiple times. Glenn was not interested in going through all the security stuff that Snowden was insisting that he went through, which in retrospect seems kind of funny, but at the time I kind of get it. If somebody's emailing you and saying, I have something for you to check out, but you have to download all these programs, I do kind of understand where Glenn was coming from on that. But anyway, Snowden ended up talking to Laura Poitras, who then got Glenn on board, because Glenn was really Snowden really wanted Glenn to be a part of this. And what they found was just a massive spying regime that it is almost impossible to overstate even now. Even though a lot of it has kind of become normalized, I think, in our politics, just really over the top spying and stuff that we didn't know back then was going on. And Glenn breaks this story at The Guardian. The Washington Post breaks some of it as well. Barton Gellman, the reporter, Laura Poitras is there as well. And it's massive. And he rides the success of this to The Intercept. And I would also say that Glenn's relationship with liberals, I wouldn't say the left, but with liberals, was already pretty damaged at this point, because he's been spending years and years and years criticizing Obama correctly for Obama's kind of embrace of all of these war powers that Bush had, and criticizing liberals in general for giving Obama a pass in the way that they never did Bush. So the reason I bring that up is that as Glenn goes to The Intercept, he kind of becomes more of a pundit and a commentariat than he is a reporter, although he does break some stories. He does do some work, especially on some Brazil stuff. And as he's doing it, he's getting more and more frustrated with liberals and with the left. And then Hillary Clinton is the nominee in 2016. And, a lot of us were opposed to her for very, I think, good reason, because of what she represented, the kind of politics that she represented, the kind of Democrat she was. For some people, and I wouldn't want to project this on Glenn, but I think that it's possible that I think he kind of saw Trump as a necessary way to shake things up. He didn't want him to get elected, but when he did, he was like, well, at least things will change now. And they did, and not for the better. And by the time that 2020 rolls around and he leaves The Intercept, he's already, going on Fox News and Tucker Carlson, and he's kind of making this shift. I should also back up and say that The Intercept was founded because Pierre Omidyar, the co-founder of eBay, gave a lot of money to found it. So this was a tech billionaire who Glenn was relying on for largesse even back then. I wrote for The Intercept. I took his money too. I'm not saying necessarily that there's anything negative about that, but I'm saying as far as the argument of the book, I think that is kind of an important point.
I think it's interesting the degree to which Greenwald, sort of by being a critic of both sides, ends up on one side. And I do think there's a way in which that can happen. As someone who definitely comes from a democratic politics background, as a journalist, once I returned to journalism, part of my job was to criticize Democrats because they have the power in California. And one of the scary things I found that I didn't like was how my stories would sometimes go viral because of the right wing. And I mean, you can really kind of meet your monthly metrics if That's the guide at a newspaper. By criticizing a Democrat as a Democrat, you get all these invitations to go on Fox and all these people who would normally ignore your work. And you really have to avoid falling into the trap of chasing that. And I never went on Fox to discuss my work or anything like that, but I can definitely see how there's this sort of algorithm that can really pull you in and be lucrative and bring you a lot of attention. And I always cringed when I knew one of my stories or columns was going viral because of Fox or because of the Daily Mail or because of any of these other outlets that were pushing it. And I can see how it's seductive. Taibbi had a similar trajectory, but kind of different, right? He was sort of a darling of the Democratic set for his writings against the Bush administration and the Iraq War and Wall Street. He came up with the whole vampire squid explanation. And now he's basically a shill for right-wing causes. And his downfall seems a bit more extreme and obvious. Can you tell us a little about Taibbi's arc?
Glenn always kind of keeps one foot in both worlds a little bit. You know, he's gone pretty far to the right at this point. I don't know if he can really reverse it, but but he still does have some positions that are, kind of lefty. Taibbi does not have that. There's going to be no way back for him if he ever wants to kind of, go to the center or the left at this point. He was a writer for Rolling Stone. I mean, before that, he was in Russia, writing The Exile, which was this satirical magazine kind of poking fun of American expats taking advantage of the fall of the Soviet Union, making a lot of money, just kind of pillaging and plundering the place. He came back and worked for a number of places, including the New York Observer, which he then kind of moved from there to Rolling Stone after Bush was reelected in 2004. He'd stay at Rolling Stone, I believe, until 2017. With a few, he left and came back a couple times, wrote a bunch of books. His stuff was pretty much universally, if not adored, at least liked by liberals. Liberals being kind of the more important group here for reasons that I'm going to explain, which is that after 2016 and Trump's election, the Democrats were kind of like looking around for any kind of explanation they could possibly find. And the one that they settled on was it was Russia. There's no real reason to do any kind of introspection here. It was a plot. We lost. They cheated, basically. Anyone who doesn't remember this may think that I'm exaggerating, but I'm not. This was really the way that things were then. Taibbi and Greenwald, and myself, although, obviously I didn't have anything near the platform I have now and still don't have anything near the platform these guys had, but and many other people pushed back on this, said this is a little ridiculous. There's a lot of media and political criticism to be made of it. Taibbi, because he had such a large platform, because he was going so hard on it, he lost a lot of the liberal audience that he had built up over time. And then throughout 2017, in the fall of 2017, he comes out with a book called I Can't Breathe, which is about Eric Garner, a victim of police, early Black Lives Matter movement. And the idea here, I think, is to kind of reset his relationship with liberals and the left somewhat, but mostly liberals. As it drops, the Me Too movement is hitting, and a lot of his past writing at The Exile comes up. He gets a lot of criticism for it, mostly from liberals, a lot of whom I think were earnest, and I think a lot of whom saw an opportunity to politically take down someone who they didn't like. And that experience of being quote unquote canceled, even though his book tour kind of got canceled, but otherwise, he didn't really suffer any ramifications for it. He didn't lose his job. It bothered and hurt him so much that he started to really tilt towards the right. He has a book called Hate Inc. that I think came out in 2019 that is an interesting critique of MSNBC and Fox, kind of using them as two sides of the same coin. I don't think that it really lands a lot of the hits that it purports to, primarily because I don't think that the MSNBC audience and the Fox audience are really analogous in the way that he thinks that they are. The book, though, kind of shows this kind of moderation in tone where he's I don't like the extremes of either side, and he's kind of shifting to the center right even then. Then COVID kicks off in 2020, and he pretty much starts to go anti-vax almost immediately, and his politics just instantly kind of spiral into just this complete lunacy. Is really the way that I would describe it. I mean, there's really no other way to describe it. It completely crazy. If you go to his Twitter account now, if you go check out his Substack now, it's anti-vax stuff. It's vicious transphobia. I'm talking about the Twitter files, which is, kind of the other radicalizing right-wing thing that happened to him, which is that Elon Musk was suggested by his billionaire friend David Sachs that he should turn this kind of carefully curated list of internal Twitter documents over to Taibbi, and that Taibbi would then quote unquote report on them and kind of break open this story of this like liberal Twitter Democratic Party censorship regime that somehow, if you kind of like look at the way the things he's arguing now, to an extent Glenn is arguing now, it's like even though Trump and the Republicans control the entire government, somehow this liberal censorship regime still exists and still has some like great power to like shut down debate on social media. It's patently ridiculous, as anyone with a brain can tell. But Taibbi does appear to believe it still, or at least to pretend to believe it. I happen to think that he does believe this stuff. I think he's that far gone. Compare and contrast with Glenn. Glenn does have certain principled positions that may be kind of tweaked in the right wing way now. But he's a critic of Israel and a supporter of Palestinian justice movements and their right to speak what they believe. Taibbi could have been relied on to say some of these things, especially the free speech stuff. But pretty much like from the beginning of the current war on Gaza, his response to this has been to kind of follow the Barry Weiss free press line. This is pretty like boilerplate right-wing stuff, but this is not the kind of thing that you would catch Greenwald saying, because I think he's smarter than that. And I think Taibbi is just like completely bought in at this point.
It is interesting, his arc, and it seems like the downfall of being canceled really radicalized him even further. He went to the one place he could still go. And I think that's the trajectory we've seen with others too. Naomi Klein talks about that in her book that she wrote about the sort of the mirror world of this sort of downfall or disgrace can leave people feeling like the only place they can go is further to the right, where there are no ethics or rules or standards really for behavior. And so then you end up there because that's what you have to do to survive. At the same time, it's a very lucrative route to take. I often joke with some of my friends, we should just start a right-wing podcast for 6 months, become millionaires, and then say we were just joking. Because it would be very easy to convert your platform or my platform into a lucrative right-wing grift, because that's the kind of thing that the right wing really goes for. They love the idea of a former liberal or leftist who is now all the way on the right, because this is modeling a kind of behavior they wish to see in the world. Another example of that is Michael Schellenberger, former left-wing PR agent, who now pretends to be a journalist, one of Elon Musk's favorite mouthpieces. And the biggest tell of all is that he has a new investigative scoop every week, when anybody with a basic level of understanding of how investigative journalism works knows you work for months or even years to get a big story. Whereas Michael Schellenberger's over here like, oh, here's what's happening to the whales, here's what's happening with UFOs. He just seems to have no idea of how the thing actually works. He's just imitating it. And again, it's been very lucrative. He has a big Substack. He's now a head of free speech over at Barry Weiss's fake university. Let's talk about the billionaires, the tech billionaires behind this movement, who are funding some of these journalistic ventures where people like Greenwald and Taibbi end up. Their idea is to buy and control the media. And your book mainly focuses on 4 men: Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, Marc Andreessen, and David Sachs. And you argue that they've essentially bought the loudest dissident voices on the left, or at least a few of them. And these instances reflect a larger move toward billionaire control of media in general. And these are guys who despise the press, but they understand its power. They fear criticism, and they hate criticism, and they want to be able to squelch it and control it, and also direct it against others at their leisure. And one way of doing that is to buy journalists and media outlets. And your book looks at these 4 guys and how they became dissatisfied with the media at some point, after kind of earlier, some of them really courting media attention, trying to be media figures. Once they became dissatisfied, they decided to do something about it. So let's talk about how these men are affecting media, starting with Peter Thiel. And I want to read a quote from your book. You quote Peter Thiel as saying, "I think they should be described as terrorists, not writers or reporters. I don't understand the psychology of people who would kill themselves or blow up buildings. And I don't understand people who would spend their lives being angry. It just seems unhealthy." Let's talk about Peter Thiel's trajectory in the media, perhaps starting with a description of what happened with Gawker.
Peter Thiel, PayPal co-founder, venture capitalist in Silicon Valley. That's how he made most of his money, all of his money, really. He founded Palantir as well, as you mentioned earlier. Gawker founded this blog called Valleywag, which kind of targeted people in Silicon Valley in kind of like a gossip blog kind of way. And Thiel was one of their targets because they kind of, pegged him as the right-wing guy that he is. They talked about his affinity for Ron Paul, and Ron Paul's racist newsletters, and kind of tied him to that. What they also did was they outed him for being gay back in like early mid 2000s, which I think personally was not a good thing to do. But it happened, I guess. One of their defenses for it was there was an open secret, to which I would respond, well, it was still a secret, so it's not really your place to do that. But some contemporaries of his who I talked to for the book, none of whom wanted to be named, but said that they thought that part of the problem was that he felt that it was kind of making him seem like he was kind of not mentally stable. That's possible too, but he kind of went to war with Gawker and funded all of these different lawsuits against them. And one of them finally hit. Hulk Hogan. There was a sex tape that Gawker published parts of.
Another questionable journalistic choice, I would say.
Yeah, I also think that was really stupid, and also not particularly newsworthy. But I guess Hogan wanted to block the publication of another tape where he used racial slurs, which eventually came out anyway. And eventually, they court shopped it until they got in Florida, and then they won and bankrupted Gawker. This was like a big victory. Later, Thiel would refer to this in an interview with Ann Coulter, kind of framed it as like him going against a dragon, or him fighting against a great evil. And I think if you think about that quote that you used of like thinking of journalists as terrorists, I mean, he really does think that way. He thinks that the press are evil, that liberals are the enemy, that the press is liberal, and so therefore the press must be the enemy as well. The full breadth and scope of Thiel's investments, especially for political purposes, is really stunning. It's overwhelming. Malcolm Harris details it in his book Palo Alto, and it's just like page after page after page after page, just listing all this stuff that Thiel is invested in. I think an important thing to know about Thiel is that he has been like this his whole life. And in his 20s, when he was at Stanford, he felt that Stanford was too liberal, and so he founded a conservative newspaper on campus that still exists to this day. So this idea of kind of funding media or founding media or whatever that would push a more right-wing position because of a lack of balance is nothing new for him. He's done this before. His investments in the media space include Rumble, which you mentioned earlier, right-wing YouTube clone. He and J.D. Vance, current vice president, former Silicon Valley investor, led a funding round for Rumble in May 2021. And just for context, Greenwald had left The Intercept in October 2020, had started a Substack, had done quite well with that. And in August 2021, they made a big deal with Greenwald, and also Tulsi Gabbard was another person, to basically move all of his content over to there. So if you say that Peter Thiel pays Glenn, he will object to that and say Peter Thiel's just an investor, a small investor in Rumble. Okay, fair enough. But he did lead the funding round that allowed them to spend money to lock Glenn up in his contract. That's been his major media investment. He has a lot of other like little investments, like kind of all over the place. But he's certainly not alone. His PayPal co-founder Elon Musk, who, as you mentioned, is now in the White House, bought Twitter in 2022. It's another information control tactic. I don't think that Musk bought it with the intention that he would use it to control political information, because I don't think that Musk is that smart or thinks that far ahead. I mean, I think he mostly bought it for ideological reasons, because he actually believes that the social media stifles conservative voices. But I do believe once he had it, he realized what a dissemination kind of powerhouse that he had in his hands, and then used it to push an agenda that he likes. And how much of that is intentional and planned out, and how much of it is just the whims of a billionaire who seems more erratic by the day is questionable, but it doesn't matter. The end result is the same. Andreessen co-created Netscape Navigator, the first really successful commercial browser for the internet, made a lot of money doing that, and then switched to VC in the 2000s, including investing in Facebook, which is how he made most of his money, I think, or at least like made a lot of his money. He has invested in a number of different media properties, including Clubhouse, which was kind of like this podcasting app that I don't think exists anymore. And he invested a lot of money into Substack, which then, took that seed money to give people money to come over to the platform from institutional media and critical independent media, and to kind of go off on their own, people who have platforms. I think that's done pretty well. His politics have been shifting right for a long time. I think 2014 is a watershed moment when he makes comments on Twitter that are questionable about colonialism in India. And, people on Twitter yell at him. And even Mark Zuckerberg says, that's not the way that we do things here on Facebook, which I think really upset Mark. And he endorsed Trump in 2024. I think mostly on the back of his interest in crypto, but also I think just generally he's been going that way for a long time. Musk, interestingly enough, has not really ever had a strong political lean either way, in my view, until probably 5 years ago when he went pretty far to the right. I think his politics were pretty flexible.
Yeah, it seems like for a long time he was mostly oriented toward his own self-interest, and now he sees his own self-interest as very much aligned with the far reactionary politics that we see emerging from Silicon Valley. He's kind of centered himself in Washington, but I don't see him as the real thinker on this stuff. We know who that is. Peter Thiel is more of the brain of the operation, the godfather of the PayPal mafia. And you have a quote in the book that's sort of about Musk, but in a way sort of about all of these guys, especially Andreessen and Musk, I would say. Now these tech leaders have created their own feedback system. They run and own and build the platforms where public discourse takes place. They participate on the platforms and consume the content that other people are producing. It's a cyclical process where those building and shaping the platforms are increasingly radicalized by their own product. That certainly seems to be the case with Musk. He talks so much about a mind virus that he's fighting, but it's so clear he's been captured by a damn mind virus. I mean, this is somebody who has gone all the way into conspiracy theory and disinformation. A lot of it seems to be he got caught up in Twitter and decided to become the main character of Twitter. And I always think of how Trump sort of rose to political power largely using Twitter as a tool. And I felt it was like a case of monkey see, monkey do, where you got Elon Musk saying, well, if he's the biggest voice on Twitter, I'll buy Twitter, and then I'll be the biggest voice on Twitter. And to me, I see more of a trajectory of his right-wing politics. I see the roots of them, but it really does seem like this radicalization took place in the last decade, or at least last 5 years. And there were some other elements like Me Too, Black Lives Matter, the George Floyd protests, the pandemic. But a lot of it with these guys being in these ecosystems where they were radicalizing others, but also radicalizing themselves. And I guess Andreessen also fits into that. And now they've decided to kind of flesh out this whole system of this. And in the 2024 election was largely seen to be the result to be the direct consequence of a new form of media and information, where the major TV stations and major newspapers are no longer the mode of broadest communication. It's all online, and a lot of it's people who are not journalists and who don't really, many of them have anything to say, but have a lot to say. And that seems to be the world in which we now live. Also on there is David Sachs, who has his All In podcast and had the Call In podcast platform that failed. He's also part of Rumble.
He is. So yeah, he is. So after Colin, and full disclosure, I had a show on Colin. They gave me money. So I worked there. I took their money for a year, and I tried to re-up, but they didn't want to. They were losing money. They offered me a worse deal, and I didn't take it. They kind of stumbled along for a little while, and then kind of just pretty much collapsed after that. And they were bailed out by Rumble, which bought their platform, made Sachs a board member, and integrated Colin's platform capabilities, on the back end, into their creator suite. So their creator suite now in Rumble, if you're a creator on Rumble, you would go into this back end, and that's kind of powered in part by Colin.
There's a lot of talk about free speech among these guys, and you portray them as weaponizing the concept of free speech while actively pursuing censorship, or at least the sort of silencing or pushing away of other voices. We've certainly seen that, especially in the form of Elon Musk, who loves to whine about free speech and being necessary for the future of civilization. That's why he bought Twitter, was to save the world. Yet at the same time, he blocks and bans and hides the speech of those he doesn't like, of his critics. And I know this very personally because I was banned from Twitter for 8 months after Elon Musk bought it for doing something that did not in any way violate any rules, and there was no recourse whatsoever. And I only got back onto Twitter because I figured out a way to do it without complying with his demands that I delete a tweet that in no way was against any kind of rule. It was kind of silly, the degree to which it was so petty. But in the book, you say this: people like Greenwald, Taibbi, Musk, Thiel, and Andreessen announce over and over again that they believe in free speech, but that's always been a smoke screen.
Yeah, well, it's a very particular approach to free speech where they believe that their free speech is being infringed upon if people are mean to them about what they say. I mean, that's basically what it is. This is a very old story. This happens with everybody as they get older. Oh, I can't say that. Oh, you're silencing me. Oh, that's not fair. I can't keep up with the new things that the new kids are saying. Blah 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 blah. I mean, that's how I see this. But instead of kind of just retreating into kind of curmudgeonly like approach to it, instead they've kind of made it into this like crusade where they believe that this is like an ACLU level like silencing of their speech. If you're on a platform like Twitter, you are subject to the whims of the company that owns it, just like you were subject to the whims of Elon Musk, which was, I want to be clear, bullshit, obviously, but it's also a private company. Like they're going to do, like, it's not the public square. These guys are treating it like it's the public square. That's not the situation here. If you want that, then advocate for it to become socialized or nationalized, and then we can have that conversation. Of course, these guys will never have that conversation because the people who are paying their bills don't want to have that conversation, but that, I think, kind of goes without saying. They have used this as a way to kind of push forward an agenda that makes it seem like there is a silencing going on of the right primarily, while kind of ignoring a lot of the sins of the actual institutional conservative power structure. Like Jim Narekas, editor-in-chief of Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, told me for the book, and I can't remember if this actually made it into the book, but he was just like listing all of this stuff. He was like book banning, book burning, attacks on people's right to gender expression, everything that's going on down in Florida with DeSantis, because at the time DeSantis was a candidate for president. He was like just listing all this stuff. He's like, they never say anything about this. Or if they do, it's like maybe every once in a very long while. They'll say, oh, like Twitter told someone they couldn't use a slur, and that's like an attack on free speech. But like the attack on the right to unionize, any of this stuff, right? These are all attacks on free speech and your right to freedom of expression. And so for some reason, these never come up. So I think that it's very obvious what they're doing.
Yeah, there's a lot of one-way logic when you're dealing with reactionaries or fascists, I find. It's okay if they do it. It's wrong if you do it, right? They can do the exact same thing, and it's because they believe whatever they do is right, is morally right, and whatever you do is wrong and morally wrong. And that's kind of how I tend to break it down to. And I think a lot of critics of them spend so much time pointing out the hypocrisy. And I think it's more important to understand that the hypocrisy is what tells you what it is. It doesn't bother them. It doesn't bother their followers. They just go along with the one-way logic. If we do it, it's right. If you do it, it's wrong. We see so much of that reversing also concepts to mean different things. Free speech means me speech, basically, for them and not for other people.
I do understand. We'll give Glenn limited credit for he has been pretty good on protest right to speech, but he always frames it as I can't believe the conservatives who are free speech warriors are following the left's path into censorship. And it's like, I don't think that's what's going on, though, man. I don't think so.
Yeah, there was even Barry Weiss, right, who the journalist bannings went too far for her, and she ends up going from being in the favor of Musk to being out of his favor because she dared to question his banning of journalists. So I think there's a degree to which some people think, well, if we're going to pretend to be for free speech, we have to sort of pretend to be for free speech. And I will say that it got me a lot more attention that I got banned from Twitter than I would have gotten by not getting banned from Twitter. I didn't even have a large account at the time, but there were news stories written about my ban. And it got me a great following starting on Blue Sky and Mastodon, because now I was some kind of heroic figure who had been banned early on. Another part of this is it seems important to these guys, and this is part of what I've been writing about the past year, to create these parallel systems, parallel government systems, parallel nonprofits, parallel unions, parallel media, parallel academia. And what they mean by a parallel media is what we've really been talking about. New kinds of journalists or so-called journalists, new kinds of outlets that pretend to be media outlets that mimic traditional media outlets, but that actually sort of serve reactionary propaganda interests. And it's not just these guys who are doing this. In the past couple of years, we've seen the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times undergo dramatic shifts as their billionaire owners pivot toward MAGA politics. And its once respected opinion page is now going to be something that only supports business interests and some weird tech billionaire idea of liberty. Same thing for the LA Times, which was a once respected forum in a solidly democratic state. And now the billionaire owner has totally become a Musk MAGA clown mouthpiece. It seems like this sort of idea is spreading beyond just this core group, and it's getting pretty far pretty fast. Right? There's two major newspapers now that have essentially fallen, or at least their opinion pages have. I don't want to insult the great reporters who are working very hard to stay on the mission of journalism, even though it's probably going to get increasingly hard. How much more disruption of this kind of established media outlets do you think we're going to see in the future?
Kind of two things there. So I think that first I would say the parallel media that you're referring to, that is something that has been really promoted by Balaji Srinivasan. And I think that there's not a mistake that he's like the guy who's been like promoting this, right? That, you know, he wants a kind of fascistic techno feudalist like network state. And it makes a lot of sense that he would not want to see an independent press pushing back, right? All he's saying there is just like an expression of what we're already describing here, which is an existing effort on the part of these tech billionaires to radicalize, decentralize, and create an alternative right-wing media ecosystem that either can take over the media or at the very least can kind of dilute the actual like reporting that might damage them or bother them. As far as the Washington Post goes, you know, I think that Bezos' directive to the opinion page was that they should talk about liberty and open markets. And my response to that I posted about this and then I went on CNN about this as well, was to say like, oh, okay, that's fine. Are you really going to like be open to liberty? Does that mean that I can write for the Washington Post about like on the opinion page about how like Amazon should be broken up? Or how Amazon, you know, shouldn't like, you know, have a monopoly on like, you know, X, Y, or Z thing that it has many monopolies at this point. It's like one of the most powerful and important companies in the world. It runs a marketplace for almost, you know, everything. And if you can, you know, confront them about it, they get flustered, but they also won't answer your questions. But, you know, the Washington Post is obviously not going to publish that opinion piece, right? This is not about liberty and open markets. Those are code words for we want a more right-wing publication. As far as the LA Times, I mean, this is just kind of the same thing. Billionaires have always had control over media to one extent or another, or not, if not billionaires, extremely rich, usually men, right? This is, the profession has been dominated by wealth. Like that part of it is not particularly new, but there was always kind of a sense, I think, of something of a civic duty and aspects of it, at least. That is now disappearing. I did an event with Max Alvarez from The Real News, Osita Nwanevu, in Baltimore. Osita said something that I thought was really interesting and insightful, which is that like the idea of the media being objective is relatively new. It used to kind of be a decentralized, you know, anybody could say anything kind of situation. Now that we're kind of heading back to that, Osita was like, I'm not really sure that I want to have like an idea of like there is one objective truth and like there is like one kind of shared understood reality. And I think that that's an interesting way to look at it, right? Like what is better? Is it better to have a lot of different information? Is it better to have kind of one accepted shared truth? Because what does that look like, right? Throughout the Cold War, that kind of looked like communism bad, capitalism good, Russia evil, US good. And, you know, like I think that caused a lot of issues as far as information getting out to the American people. Same thing happens now, I think, with Washington Post editorial page, any of these editorial pages where they're kind of just talking about how, you know, like there are certain parameters for what you can discuss and what you can't discuss. I honestly think that media right now is going through an evolutionary period, and what's going to come out at the end of it is going to be much different than it has been before, but it's going to have some elements of it. And I think that we're kind of witnessing the kind of back and forth of that change happening right now. And one of the reasons that these guys are investing is they want to control it.
You know, I often say they're not wrong about everything. The establishment, the political establishment, the media establishment are weak and vulnerable and ripe for disruption. And they're ready to strike, and they have enough money to be effective at it. And I think about the fact that, you know, I mean, we both have newsletters now, and that it's not a new idea, but a way to make it easier to get paid directly. Kind of also undermines, though, traditional media. but I don't really see myself ever going back to try to get a job at a traditional newspaper where I can't do what I want, or there's some rich owner who's going to get offended, or a hedge fund's going to buy it and decide that you can't write certain things. And those are experiences that I've had. And the choice is either to stop writing and just go get a comms job somewhere and give up on this, or to find your own way. And it's hard, but I'd say the technology has made it easier. But it's scary to think about what's happening to the journalism establishment. And I think that, the history of newspapers, if you look back in this country and other countries, was that newspapers did take a position. They did have a voice and a political bent, and there were a lot more of them back in the day. And we've got this strange idea of objectivity, which seems to mean that we must even stay neutral in the face of fascism and authoritarianism. If one side wins, the freedom of speech and newspapers will no longer exist. Journalists won't have a role. So I think you actually have to have a position on fascism and authoritarianism. A journalist has a duty to defend democracy. And I think there are some people in high paid positions at very successful publications who think that they can stay out of it and that they will somehow be okay no matter what. And I think they're in for a rude awakening if we do end up living under an authoritarian regime, which some would argue we already kind of are to some degree, because you can't really be neutral in the face of that. And I think they might realize too late that that's the case. I've seen it already. And you think about people like Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, launches a podcast. And it's basically a MAGA love fest, where when he's not nodding in agreement with people like Charlie Kirk and Steve Bannon, he's shining their shoes with his tongue. And so we were seeing this algorithm and this opportunity for independent media to take the place of traditional media pop up in interesting and strange places. And I think it's a big, dangerous sign for the future.
Speaking of the future, stick around after these quick plugs for Gil and Eoin's takes on what's next for the broligarchs and the media. Buy Eoin's book, Owned, How the Tech Billionaires on the Right Bought the Loudest Voices on the Left, wherever you get your books. Follow his Substack, The Flashpoint, at owenhiggins.substack.com. And follow him on Blue Sky at Eoin Higgins. Now back to the decimation of our democracy by the billionaire class.
So your book is a warning, and it's a personal one for you, I'd say, for me as well. What's the end game here for both the billionaires and for journalism? What's the path forward?
I don't 100% know what's going to happen with journalism. I'm not good at anything else, so I'm just going to keep doing it. I'm not really that good at anything else. So certainly not that I enjoy. I enjoy writing. I enjoy being a journalist. So I'm going to continue to do it. But I think that the state of the industry right now, as opposed to when I stumbled into it 10 years ago, is a lot different. And I think that there are a lot of challenges that are there that aren't there anymore. What's really interesting is that despite the fact that there are a lot more ways to get your name out there and a lot more ways to create your own career, it's kind of paradoxically more difficult to do that now. And part of that is because when I kind of came up, social media was such a driver of links and writing and people's voices, and now it's not. And that's one of the things that they've done. They've done that on purpose. Facebook, Twitter, Threads, to the extent that thing exists. I think Blue Sky is really the only one that actually embraces link sharing, which I think is why journalists are all flocking to it, right? I mean, this is one thing about the book, right? The book is not really a call to action so much as it's I'm just trying to explain what this is. And I think that the more informed people are about this kind of stuff, the better, so that they can make their own kind of information diet decisions.
Thanks for writing this very important book, and I hope people will buy it and read it, because if you want this kind of media to continue to exist, it is very important that you spend the money, because that sends the signal to the companies that this is what people want and that they need to do more of it. And I love public libraries, but if you can spare it, please buy the book. I'm in a few pages of it, and if you buy it, we'll thank you personally, so let us know.
The Nerd Reich is written and hosted by Gil Duran. It's produced by R.R. Robbins. Write us a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Follow us on YouTube and sign up for the newsletter at thenerdreich.com. See you next time. Hopefully.